Hello, and welcome to a special sponsored spotlight episode of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. In this episode, Ben gets to sit down and speak to two members of Meta's independent oversight board, set up with great fanfare back in 2020, and which is sometimes likened to a Supreme Court-style body for content moderation. At the end of last year, the board produced its 5-year report charting how it had evolved from an innovative experiment in platform governance to becoming what it likes to call an essential institution for internet users and their online rights. In this episode, Ben talks to two members of the board, Paolo Carrozza and Giulia Wano, about what that actually means in practice for users, for Meta, and for the wider ecosystem of online speech, and how the board plans to execute on its considerable ambitions. So please enjoy.
Paolo, Julie, first of all, welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Really glad to have you on the podcast for today's sponsored Spotlight episode. And a big thanks to the Oversight Board for financially supporting Ctrl-Alt-Speech and the work that Mike and I do each week. Before we get into today's discussion, I want to do you the courtesy and good service of introducing you both to our listeners. Paolo Carrozza is a professor of law and concurrent professor at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, an expert in constitutional and international human rights law, and a current co-chair of the Oversight Board. And Giulia Wano is the executive director of Internet Without Borders, a non-profit that defends citizens' digital rights and promotes the free flow of information online, as well as a research affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center and a member of the Oversight Board. Great to have you both here today.
Thanks, man. It's great to be here. Been a frequent listener and learned a lot from your podcast, so it's a privilege to be on it with you.
Brilliant. So glad to have you here. Let's get started then with a bit about the Oversight Board, because it's something that has been really described in various terms over the 5 years that it has been around. Most people often just talk about it as a Supreme Court for content moderation. But I wondered actually how you both describe it to your friends and family and colleagues. What is the kind of way that you explain it to others?
I guess I can start, Ben. I describe it as an oversight body that is charged with making decisions and policy recommendations on difficult and important content moderation problems on Meta's platforms. I will say quickly that I don't like the Supreme Court analogy because it tends to focus on our resolving individual decisions, which certainly we do. But the more important thing that we do is we try to make sort of broad systemic improvements across the whole ecosystem of Meta's platforms.
Yeah, completely agree with Paolo's description here. And what particularly strikes out for me is the role of the board in kind of ensuring a fair balance between, the rights of free expression and other very important fundamental rights for users, and how really the board helps and supports a company like Meta to center decisions to ensure that these rights are respected. So that's how I try to describe it to friends and colleagues.
And that important aspect of defending individuals' rights online, I mean, that feels like a really core part of what the board does and potentially why you both agreed to join the board. Can you give a little bit of background as to how you both came to be on the board in the first place? Because it's something we don't often hear about is how the board members ended up there and what it's like to be on the board.
Yeah, Julie, why don't you start? You were one of the original members. I came on later, so probably best for you to give a sense of the origins.
Yes. Well, I will get a little bit personal there because it's really, I think, an interesting story. I came on the board because I found on social media as a young woman at the time, I'm still very young. I was younger at the time. I was not living in my country. I'm not originally from France. Now I am, but I was not at the time. I was not French. I was studying in the country, and I can say, pretty much my fate was traced as an immigrant and Black woman in a foreign country, European country. But I found with social media platforms, really a platform to speak, to express, to share unfiltered opinions. And these opinions, gave me access and opportunities to so many other great things. And I wanted to, in all of my work, I've always wanted to ensure that this would be the same for anyone else so that people would have the ability to express themselves and to have opportunities from that expression. And so when the debate around creating a sort of a court of appeals or Supreme Court. But of course, we've seen that the analogy is not necessarily perfect here. But when discussions emerge about an appeals mechanism to ensure that people would have the ability to defend their right to speak on the platform, I thought I have to be part of that. And yes, that's how I decided to join.
Amazing. And what about you, Paolo, coming on later on?
Yeah, in my case, I was recruited about 2 years into the board's activity. And I was one of the very first people identified and recruited and appointed by the board itself rather than by Meta as part of the original group. And I think, my now colleagues on the board did so largely because I had about 3 decades of experience in international human rights, including leading major human rights institutions, both in the Americas and in Europe. And it was that sort of institutional human rights experience that both was not just the reason for my recruitment, but the reason why I was interested in it. This strikes me as really sort of the forefront of, the next generation of institutional creativity, innovation for the protection of human rights around the world.
It certainly feels like that, Paolo, and Everything in Moderation, the newsletter that I write, some listeners will be familiar with, has followed that over the last 5 years, and we'll come on to the report that you're both here to talk about. Before we do, I want to get a sense of what it's like to be sent one of the cases. We had Kenji, another board member, on the podcast a few weeks ago. He was co-hosting when Mike was away, and he talked a bit about that process. But what is it like when you kind of receive a case, or you're part of the process of deciding what cases the board takes on? Do you feel a sense of responsibility, or is there a kind of importance to the selection process that you feel?
Oh, absolutely. I think the core background question for all of us, and these are, the selection happens in a committee of 5 or 6 members at any given time that rotates. But I think all of us on the committee are always trying to be attentive simply to what's going on in the world, right? Where is there a crisis? Where is there an election? Where is there consistent reporting of a particular problem, regarding freedom of speech or basic safety issues on the platform? The different geographies of the world. So I guess that's a long way of saying what drives, I think, everybody here is sort of a constant attentiveness to what are users' needs. Where are the needs acute at this moment around the world and on what themes? And how can we sort of dig through the tens of thousands of cases we're receiving all the time in order to find the ones that are most emblematic of those more broad range problems that people are facing?
And Julie, do you find that the representation of the board is really important in getting to the heart of who are the users in need at this very point in time? What kinds of discussions do you end up having with other board members in that process?
Oh, absolutely. The global experts who compose the board today are an essential part of how the case selection process works. We have colleagues all over the world, really, in Australia, in Taiwan, in Europe, the UK, in Ghana, in South Africa. So it's really a snippet of the world at a given moment, just like Paolo was saying. And the fact that we are all colleagues with these diverse perspectives and points of views, but also experiences, geographic locations, are a wealth of knowledge that we can put into the case selection process in order to choose cases that will be the most impactful, that will, of course, address the individual issue, but offer an opportunity to the board and also to the company to address sometimes blind spots that the company itself has. I have examples in which the company was actually grateful for the board having chosen a specific case. Can give some examples. We've had cases coming from Ethiopia at a moment when there was a conflict, an active conflict in the Amhara region a few years ago. The board surfaced the really difficult question of rumors. How do you balance the expression with rumors and conflict, right? Or there was another case coming from Iran about political speech, figurative political speech, and in this case, calling for the death of a leader. How do you balance the right to free expression and political expression specifically with, of course, the right not to harm somebody else, and in this case, a public figure? So yes, we have this global perspective that the board brings. Is really a way for a company like Meta to be 1-2 steps ahead by surfacing sometimes very difficult questions and blind spots that the company may have.
Yeah, and I think the report, which we'll come on to talk about, it does a really good job of outlining some of those really tricky decisions that you've had to make and some of the, I guess, the broad range of cases that you've taken on. Before we go in, that point around the communication with Meta and receiving kind of thanks from the company for looking at specific cases, what does that communication process look like in practice? Who is liaising with who? Give us a kind of a sense under the hood of the dynamics there and what you've maybe been most surprised by.
I'd say it's important to answer the question on two different levels. There are a lot of very formalized, structured points of contact in order to exchange information, right? I mean, part of the reason that the board is such a valuable institution, in my view, is because we have a particular kind of relationship of confidence in which we can request and receive a great deal of confidential information from Meta. That requires a certain institutional trust, certain structured guarantees to protect that information, negotiations around what we can reveal and things like that. And in order to do that in a way that protects the board's independence, that's highly structured along certain very formal lines between our permanent staff and their counterparts aboard. But necessarily at a different level, there are also much more informal kinds of conversations, that take place simply because we meet with each other, we have conversations. And it's in that latter sort of group of exchanges that I think one of the things that was most interesting and surprising to me, coming from a context where I've worked either in universities or in public institutions and not in the private sector, is simply how complex an institution Meta is and how many different points of view there are. So when we engage in the conversations, it's really clear that there are lots of different points of view that pull different directions within the company. And often it's hard for them to resolve exactly those different views. They also evolve. So in the course of our conversations, I mean, there are people who, when the board was first started, were very explicitly and avowedly against the board and didn't want the board to be established, thought it was a waste of money, a waste of, a risk. And now who are very outspoken advocates of what the board has contributed. And so I think that dynamism and complexity within the company is helpful to be aware of and something that we always need to be in some kind of dialogue with at a more informal level as well.
Yeah, really interesting. So let's get on to the report then. This is a report that came out just before the end of last year, just before the Christmas break for those who celebrate it. And the report is entitled From Bold Experiment to Essential Institution: How 5 years of independent oversight made Meta more accountable and protected the rights of users. Can you explain why you think the board has moved from kind of experiment to essential institution and unpack a little bit more about who you think it's essential for?
Yeah, why it's become an essential institution because of the changes that it has brought to Meta's platforms. We've brought those changes through one of the points of criticism of the board, which is, you only work on 60-ish cases per year, and that's nothing compared to the millions or billions of pieces of content posted. But what we can say is that the case selection process, which we have discussed, really helps us surface those cases that will help the company solve a problem that affects not just one user, but really the entire experience for all users virtually on the platform. I'll share examples here. I guess it's the best moment to do that. First and foremost, we've protected speech. We've helped protect political speech, one of the most important speeches in a democracy, right? We've helped people be able to criticize their leaders, sometimes in countries where they would not be able to do so. We've also empowered users themselves to understand the decisions that are being made by the company. We've recommended, and then the company accepted our recommendation. We've recommended the company to ensure that users are aware why their content was taken down in the first place. If you remember Facebook, for instance, as I do 7 years back, your content was taken down and that was the end of the story. Now it's different. You have a reason why it's taken down. You know what policy you violated, and you offered sometimes even ways to correct that behavior. We've learned about initiatives that the company, that Meta, has put in place to allow users to correct course before posting a publication. We've also encouraged more transparency from the company. And that transparency has now become kind of industry-wise. I mean, we've seen transparency reports from companies increasingly since the board has started its operations that are getting more details on government influence, for instance. That was an issue that was very secret before. I don't want to say before the board, but I really want to believe that we've helped take the criticism, the really important and helpful, constructive criticism that existed before with regards to relationship between companies and governments behind closed doors. We've helped taken those criticism to a point where the company has accepted, we've recommended, and the company has accepted to publish more information about those relationships. For instance, Meta now notifies users when their content was removed due to a government request, for instance. And unless it's restricted by law, now the company identifies which government entity made the request. I mean, imagine again, back where we were on these issues. We've also, the most important, I would say, one of the most important work of the board is that we've shed light on the cross-check mechanism. For those who don't know or don't remember, we had a policy advisory opinion through which we make policy recommendations to the company that are not just specific to one case, but are really that affect the broad policies of the company. And what we exposed through that policy advisory opinion was that Meta had a content moderation pipeline through which it treated high-profile users differently than us, the common users. And we revealed that this pipeline had backlogs, that it had also special treatments that was not necessarily transparently, adjudicated. So we do have an essential role in ensuring and helping a company correct course and some behaviors, shed light, as I was saying, on some things that are not working, blind spots, but also help a company have 1-2 years advanced knowledge, have an opportunity to really correct course while working with the Oversight Board.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the cross-check program was one of the standout, I think, decisions for me. That was a story that the Wall Street Journal broke, if I remember rightly, in which high-profile sports stars, politicians were given basically a direct route into the policy team at Meta and had content taken down that probably shouldn't have been taken down in some cases. Thanks for kind of outlining that, Julie. Paolo, the idea of Meta kind of taking the recommendations from the board and doing something with them was something that people were very skeptical about at the start, including, it sounds like, that internal employee you referred to earlier. Have you been surprised by just how many decisions the company has taken and changed or enacted as a result of your work?
To be honest, no, I'm not surprised for a few reasons. I mean, if I could sort of take half a step back, and I'll answer that question by piggybacking on Julie's answer of the previous one. One of the ways in which I think the board is an essential institution is not simply for the company and not simply for the users, but sort of for the public space in general. It's clear that it's so vast, so complex. I mean, you and Mike like to say all the time, content moderation at scale can't be done well. It's impossible. And so it's always relative. You're always trying to work at the margins to improve it. And in that context, it's absolutely clear that the companies by themselves can't do it. Their incentives are misaligned. They can't be trusted, frankly, to simply take care of their own responsibilities on their own. It's also increasingly clear 5 years into our experiment that public regulation is inadequate too. It's either insufficient because it lags behind, or it's insufficient because it's much too heavy-handed and serves a variety of other interests, not the rights of users, but the interests of people in power. And so an essential institution is one that fills that gap, right? That helps to fill that space in between those two and provides an independent but engaged voice like ours. And that's exactly the context in which it doesn't surprise me that the recommendations get accepted, right? Because as Julie pointed out earlier, there are tons of gaps. There are necessarily gaps in what's being done, both from a regulatory point of view and from the self-governance and regulatory point of view of the companies. We're filling those gaps. We're trying to point them out and to fill them in as they go. And we've gotten a lot better at doing that. A lot of our recommendations, or fewer of our recommendations, were accepted and implemented early on in the board, and now they are at a much higher rate, in part because we've learned a whole lot more about technically how the system works, what's possible, what's not, what's economically viable, what's effective, and so forth. So as we've improved and as the needs necessarily continue, I think the company sees that it's good both for the quality of their product as well as for the public accountability that is necessary, that our recommendations should be followed in most cases. Probably about 3/4 of them get implemented either in whole or in the process of being implemented right now.
Yeah. And there's a whole process I've come to learn about tracking that implementation, which I think is a fascinating part in and of itself. We'll go into, you both touched on the criticism that some people have made about the board, and I want to go into a bit more detail about that, some of the kind of commentary around the board and the recent report. But one of the things that I think demonstrates the essentiality of the board is its expanded scope since it was founded 5 years ago. So it focuses on Threads as a platform, whereas it started off as a Facebook and Instagram only. It's now looking at content being restored and taken down on those platforms. There are various ways that it has kind of grown its influence. Were those changes kind of driven by user demand or by what the company was looking to do or by the board and what it saw in the broader, I guess, online ecosystem?
If I could very briefly start on this, I would say it's a mix of all those three. We have seen, for instance, how it has been pushed by the board itself is through the fact that we realized very soon that the content decisions issue was not just a take down or leave up discussion. There was a gray area in between that needed to be addressed as well. And that's why, in common agreement with the company, we decided also to allow the board to make decisions to add interstitials instead of taking down or leaving up, adding additional information about content or sort of a filter to hide the content. So that's when it came from the board. Now, it also came from users, from the fact that we are seeing, for instance, they wanted to better understand how the recommendations were made, since those recommendations are not binding. So how do you ensure that the fact that they're non-binding has any effect? So we rapidly, in conversation again with the company, realized that it would be important to make sure there is a tracking of the recommendations made. It also comes from the company itself. As almost immediately as soon as Threads became available, the company reached out and said, would you be interested in also taking a look at Threads? And it made sense because it's also a platform where users express themselves and there are policies. So I think it came from all these three different stakeholders. And also it came from a lot of the experiences that we've had during in the course of the past 5 years.
Yeah. Paula, anything to note on that?
I'd just say this, Ben. I mean, we don't pretend. It would be greatly naive to suggest that the Oversight Board by itself is the answer to the problem of all the problems on Meta's platforms, let alone in the industry as a whole. It is only one small actor in a vast ocean of responsibility in this area. I think one that is making great contributions. And so we acknowledge that there's a lot of things that are outside of our scope that are really important to human rights, to freedom of speech, and to users' experiences on the platforms. But exactly in that recognition, we're constantly pushing to expand what we can do so that we can contribute more. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And that's, I think, an interesting segue into talking about the value of the board. And there have been critics who say that the board is expensive, as Julie mentioned earlier, for the number of cases that it hears. You have heard a fair few cases, the scope of them has been broad, as you say, and you have this newly kind of expanded remit. How valid is that criticism, sitting on the inside and receiving these cases? And what other ways would you like for the board's efficacy to be measured? What other kind of KPIs do you think about as an institution?
Well, look, I welcome criticism of the board on everything, including its financial accountability. I mean, we're an institution that's trying to drive transparency and accountability. It would be foolish for us to resist that kind of criticism. So yes, bring it on, make us better by criticizing us. I welcome it. But specifically on the financial challenges, I'd say a few things. One is the board is an expensive institution as a human rights institution. There's no question about that. But it represents less than 1/100% of Meta's turnover annually. That's a pretty small price to pay for things like having a crisis protocol in place that was driven by the board's recommendations, or an election integrity system that was driven by the board's recommendations. And so the right way to measure the adequacy of the return on the investment, so to speak, is not by case numbers. The board has never been about an industrial scale content moderation resolution mechanism for massive numbers of people. It's precisely about trying to resolve a small number, but very difficult and impactful issues. And so, the right way to evaluate it and whether it's worthwhile is by doing what we try to do, but doing it independently and holding us accountable to it, which is tracking the impact empirically across the entire system of Meta's platforms on a global basis. What are the impact of our recommendations and decisions? Who has benefited? How many people? When users now in hundreds of millions have access to content moderation policies in their own languages as a result of that, that's a pretty high payoff, I think, that can't be measured simply by saying X number of dollars per case are being spent. And the last thing I'll say is this. The investment in content moderation in general has been declining. We know that over the industry. And so for the board to continue to represent an investment, significant investment that continues to put humans in the loop of responsibility over these questions is incredibly valuable and worth a big investment, right? Because otherwise the decline in cost is all because everything's being automated increasingly. And that's great in the sense that as the automation gets better, more people have more accurate enforcement of the rules applied to them and so forth. But there needs to be a level of human responsibility as well. And that's more expensive than just applying another algorithm to the content moderation process.
Yeah, and the report makes very clear that artificial intelligence and automation is increasingly a focus of the board's work. Julie, I wondered, you've just come out of board meetings that look ahead to next year and beyond. What are the kind of biggest unresolved questions, or what do you think will be the focus for the board in the coming 12 to 18 months, let's say?
Yes. Well, first of all, we do have a very important policy advisory opinion that was sent our way a few weeks ago about community notes. We also have accounts level policies that we're going to start working on. So these are very exciting. But beyond that, there is obviously the question of artificial intelligence, right? And how it's being used on Meta's platforms, both for content, including content generation, but also for moderation. On content generation, for instance, I think the value of the board, which we're talking about, was quite evident 2 years ago when ChatGPT really started emerging. The board published a decision that related to manipulated media at the time. That was how the policy of Meta. Its manipulated media did not touch on issues related to artificial intelligence. And the board was one of the first to recommend, based on external stakeholder engagement that we did with organizations that work in this space, in the artificial intelligence space, and responsible and ethical innovation in this space. We've worked with them, we've engaged with them, and we've made a recommendation based on this engagement. And that recommendation has led the company Meta to label when content is generated artificially. And the company itself published how much this labeling brought to engagement with artificially generated content. The numbers were like in millions, probably even billions on Instagram. People engaged when they had the AI label. People clicked on it, read about it, and learned more about this new innovation. And that was 2 years ago, right? Another very interesting future in this space is that, yes, we are also interested in being in conversation with new set of stakeholders in this space, and particularly advisors of AI startups, investors in AI startups who are certainly concerned about the risks. There are plenty of risks. There's a lot of potential for innovation. And I know much of the conversation in AI is focused on innovation. At the same time, the risks are very real. Every single day we have news about suicides, especially in youth. And that's another scope in which we are very interested in. I'll come to that in a few seconds. But we have news every day about the risk of AI. How can an entity, an independent, and that's important, independent entity, we have no stake in all of this. Our only stake is to ensure that humans and users remain central and remain a central preoccupation for the benefit of society. So that's a very important, interesting area in which We will be more vocal and present still in collaboration with stakeholders who are working in this space. And of course, youth rights. There's a lot of focus on safety of children. As a mother myself of a preteen who is getting more interested in social media, these are conversations that I look at and listen to very carefully. At the same time, there are lots of questions that are not being asked. One of the first questions is, do our kids have the right to free expression too? Do they have the right to express themselves on those social media platforms? That's a question that would potentially be asked to Australian lawmakers, for instance, who have passed a law recently, who enforced a law recently to ban social media to under 16 years old. Do parents have a role to play? Absolutely. But what is the nature of that role? Do companies have a responsibility? Yes. And what does that responsibility look like in a time where the industry is developing different set of parental controls that do not necessarily align with each other? Is there an avenue there for an independent body like the board to come in and say, hey, we have a lens, we have a framework that's called human rights, and that's still very relevant. That is the concentrate of what humanity think is important in terms of human dignity. And in this time of technological evolution and progress and disruption, here's the framework that we can bring in your innovation process. And that can give you 1, 2, 3 years advance, sometimes even 5, compared to other competitors in terms of putting that human back into the loop. So there's a lot of exciting things that I'm personally very much looking forward as a board member.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got your hands busy there. You've got a lot to be working on as an institution, as a group. Particularly interested in the kind of youth safety, which is a topic that Mike and I talk about very frequently on the podcast. Paolo, if you've just published this 5-year report, it details all of the impact and cases that you've taken on in that time. What will the 10-year board report look like? What would it say? What would its title be if you could have your way?
Well, if the board is successful over the next 5 years, I think the next report would, at a minimum, have 2 big themes to it. One is that the board has served as a template or a model for other institutions of independent oversight in the industry. Not that the board is going to do that for everybody, but that, the board still stands out. 5 years later, it still stands out as unique. I'm all in favor of the advisory bodies that other company actors are standing up on a variety of issues. I'm sure they provide a lot of value, but they're not independent. They don't select their own membership or leaders. They don't operate transparently. They don't set their own agendas, all things that we do and that are necessary to providing independent accountability. So if 5 years from now we're successful, there will be more bodies like the board in its independence and oversight roles. The second thing is that it will have expanded not just at the margins of more issues within the traditional social media space, but it will have expanded to other kinds of technologies. I can't help but notice, and you and Mike have talked about this a little bit yourselves in some of your episodes lately, that the moment that we're in terms of AI and generative AI and chatbots, in some ways seems remarkably similar to 5 years ago in terms of like this surge of concern about safety issues, how to balance that with the core sort of expansion of expression and connectivity that these technologies give us. It's a moment that's so strongly parallel in my mind that there's a lot to learn from the experience of the board over these last 5 years. And so if some of those lessons are pulled into and help to shape the landscape of independent accountability and oversight in the AI and generative AI space, then that's another way in which I think that the next 5 years we will have been very successful.
And Julie, what about you? If you were to look back in 2030 at the work that the board has done, what would you hope to have achieved?
First, that agility that Paolo has just referred to, it's really in the DNA of the board. We've adapted to different times in the past 5 years. But agility without renouncing to the core mission, which is to ensure that users, no matter who they are, no matter where they are not an afterthought when innovating in technology. I think that would be what I would love to see 5 years from now. I will not be on the board anymore, technically, because it's a maximum of 3 year terms. But that's what I would really love to see in the next 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, a very, very interesting 5 years ahead. I really hope the board is successful in its work, and it's been fascinating to chart its progress over the last 5 years, and great to read the report which documents some of that interesting work that you brought to life today. Just want to say thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have you on the podcast. We hope listeners enjoyed today's Spotlight episode. Paolo, Julie, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com.